Hi, and welcome to Deer IQ, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, 20-plus year educator, 30-plus year deer hunter, untastefully seasoned outdoor writer, and I'm here to help you achieve what we all hope for, to be truly greater deer hunters. This is part one in our series, Public Land Hunting Mastery, and asking the question, is public land hunting ruined? Today we're with Dr. Jeff Kelly, an uncommonly successful public land hunter, to give his take and what he thinks are the new approaches needed for success on public land, especially in this new ultra-pressured post-COVID landscape. As we start, I want to challenge you to do a couple things. First, download our free journal to use with this podcast. That's really going to help. Second, as you use that, here are the top look-fors or things to look for during this episode. What is Jeff's number one tactic that hasn't changed in 20 years that he thinks is most critical? How does e-scouting need to be looked at differently? What's the Disneyland mentality and Jeff's approach to beating it? And there's a lot more nuggets in there too to pay attention for. And I have a challenge at the end that I believe will truly take your hunting skills up several notches, so make sure to stay and listen for that. And now let's get to the podcast and up your Deer IQ. All right, welcome to the Deer IQ podcast. I'm here with Jeff Kelly. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You probably don't know who Jeff is because he's not like a TV personality. Doesn't have his own YouTube channel. He's not trying to sell something, which I think's even greater. But he's actually my chiropractor. And so over the past probably, 10 years or so, we've exchanged a lot of stories, just deer hunting stories, and come to realize just how good a hunter Jeff is, especially with public land deer hunting. But Jeff, before we jump into this, tell us a little bit about yourself so the listener kind of knows your background, some of your just hunting resume, and just what you think is important.
Sure, yeah. I've been hunting my whole life. Living in Michigan, it's can be a challenge. So, about 20 years ago, I decided to tackle the road trips out of state. So, I've been public land deer hunting for the past 20 years. I've taken mature whitetail in probably 12 or 13 states throughout the country. It's just kind of my passion to leave every fall and chase whitetail for 10 or 12 days in a lot of the different states around the Midwest. So
you said you've been doing it about 20 years. What are some of the different states, just to give an idea?
I really stick around the Midwest a lot. I've hunted Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa. But I've also ventured up into the kind of the plains areas and even out west. I've hunted whitetail in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana. So I don't really stick to one place. I've enjoyed hunts in all those states. All of them have their benefits, and all of them are challenging, especially in today's day and age where public land hunting has been more difficult. This year, I plan to probably hit maybe Wisconsin, possibly Kansas if I get drawn, and maybe even Iowa.
Gotcha. So pretty wide range in experience, and I can attest, just the consistency at which you've been successful at getting not just deer but good bucks in those different short trips really that you've taken year after year. So just to kind of dive into it here, public land hunting, is it ruined? And we've seen a lot of challenges, I think, the last few years, and I'll call it the post-COVID era, really. I think it's changed a lot. And you don't have to go very far online, on social media, everywhere, and you just hear guys talking about how crowded it is. It used to be challenging It used to be something that a lot of guys shied away from, but now it's almost kind of becoming the opposite. What have you seen change over the last 20 years as far as public land hunting?
More pressure. I mean, that's by far the biggest thing, and it's not even really the last 20 years. I would say, the last 5 years. And I do think there's several reasons for it. I mean, a big part of it is social media. In YouTube, and I mean, it's being exploited a lot more. The public land hunting, and not that I think that there's anything wrong with that. It's just becoming, more challenging. And I think another part of it is, private land access isn't what it used to be either. I mean, I used to be able to go out to, say Kansas, and knock on 10 doors, and, you're going to get permission out of two or three of them to go hunt their property. But I mean, there's a lot of big leasing companies now, national leasing companies. I mean, you don't have to look too far on the internet to find a number of leasing companies, and high dollar leases. And I think the outfitting business has also expanded a lot over the years. So the days of knocking on doors and getting permission on private land is a lot different now. Not that it can't be done. I mean, you can still do that successfully, but it's definitely not like it once was. So, but public land hunting is still alive and well. There's still a lot of ways to be successful with public land hunting. So.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I actually just recently wrote an article about the public land explosion and just the causes of it, like any explosion, kind of relating that to even like gunpowder in a gun. And you have fuel, you have an ignition, and you have the confining pressure is what, really causes the explosion and pushes the bullet out. And it's the same way here, just mentioning the popularity that's risen almost like a fad. It's like a feather in your cap to even do it. And so that just adds so much to it. And so let's dig into then, some of these things that you've done and just how you've done that. What are some tactics and things that you have found success with?
Probably the biggest thing is scouting. That hasn't changed in the last 20 years. I would say I'm scouting different areas than I did in the past. It's everybody knows the well-known areas around the country, and the A-list areas, and those aren't really places I target anymore. You used to go to some of these more well-known areas, and you could get away from the people, but I've kind of crossed off a lot of those A-list areas, and going to more of what I consider the B-list, because there's still plenty of good mature bucks in a lot of these places that people aren't, that don't necessarily see on YouTube or whatever it may be. So the scouting still the most important thing. Scouting has changed a ton also. I mean, the digital scouting is better than it's ever been. And that's where I always start, is with digital scouting. Whether it be using some of the apps out there, topo maps, whatever it may be. I try to have a pretty good idea, before I even go into a new area, of the lands I want to check. I have possible hunt locations already marked before I go into a new area. That way I've done a lot of my homework when at home before I even get into these places. And then it's just a matter of getting your boots on the ground. But if I have 15 pieces of property I want to check, I may have a bunch of hunt locations I want to look at, and then it's just a matter of putting on the miles when you get there. And that's a big part of it. I will spend 2, 3, 4 days scouting before sometimes I even set up. So
Yeah, so to just kind of jump in there, so how much of your time, if you may get a little more detail, how much of your time and what does it really look like when you're doing e-scouting, and how much time do you put into that versus boots on the ground scouting? Is it like a 50-50 thing? Is it, what does that more specifically look like?
um, the e-scouting is definitely more time spent than anything. Just especially if you're going into a new area, um, because I mean you've got to have. I think you have to have a lot of options when you go into a new area. So hours spent e-scouting. That's easy to do. You can do it from home. You can do it in your free time. Because I don't take big long trips every fall. I mean, my average trip is only maybe 10 days each fall. So the more homework I can do ahead of time cuts down the boots on the ground when you get out there. I mean, it doesn't replace it, but it does cut down on a lot of the time you need to spend when you go into a new area. Um, the fortunate thing is once you've been doing this a while, you have spots where you can typically go back to, and you have to spend less time over the years. But initially, especially going into a new spot, it can be very challenging. I mean, you might be taking one for the team the first year you go out there, but the second year, it's a lot easier.
How many of those spots, so I was thinking back through the years and how things have increased with pressure and how easily accessible. So one of the things that I think about is 20 years ago when we didn't have apps and you had to actually get a map like from the county, or it was much more difficult to find even just access to maps, let alone just pulling up something on your phone. And now this is kind of leveled the game, I think, for a lot of people. So any hunter can access the same information fairly easily to eScout, right? And I can see the same things that you see, and it, I think, really increases the ability of everybody to see what was much harder to see years ago, right? So as you get into some of these spots, maybe it's, I don't know, a funnel somewhere you've identified on a map, and maybe talk about that a little bit, like specific things you're looking for on when you're e-scouting. And as you do that, are you running into more hunter sign now because of maybe the whole app thing bringing other people up to that level?
Sure, yeah. Um, and yeah, there's a couple things with that. I mean, with everybody being on that playing field of e-scouting, you have to look at the e-scouting even a little different, I think. So, I mean, the average person can pull up an app, and there's going to be again what I call those A spots, even when you're digital scouting or e-scouting, and those really obvious good funnels, big parcels of property. Um, you know, that's where those are where the hunters are going to be too. So, I don't necessarily look for you know, those money spots, digital scouting, because I know there's typically going to be, a fair amount of pressure there. So, and so I'm looking at more spots that might be overlooked, or, for example, spots that may not even have a lot of trees on them. I always tell people deer don't live in trees, so you don't have to be necessarily hunting big timber. But people, especially if they're new to e-scouting, I think they're drawn to specific things, and they some things are pretty obvious when you are scouting, and so I'm trying to look at the less obvious spots. because I think the less obvious spots, that's not where you're gonna, find the people as much. So, and even harder to access spots. That's, I think, a big key. I mean, fortunately, there's still a lot of lazy hunters out there, and that helps. I mean, there's still most people aren't willing to put in the work to get into some of the more difficult areas too. So that part's a lot more challenging than it ever has,
Yeah,
because you go ahead.
everybody, every hunter, every person has a lazy bone, right? And so it's really fighting that, and how many guys will, even if they're kind of trying hard, will get lazy. And so it's, you just have to be way less lazy than you used to be, I guess, and find those even harder to reach spots. This past spring, just to go off what you said there, I did some local scouting, spring scouting for spots, and my goal was to go way back in, as far as I could from the road over a mile to like this swampy area that was like, the typical going deep spot. I think that's been the mantra, go deep, get away from the other guys. And on the way there, like a couple hundred yards from road, I found some really good fall sign, and even some fresh, like big poop, and some big scrapes, and you could tell that no one had, and big rubs, and no one had hunted there at all. And then, so I marked that, and made note of it. And then I got back into the deep spot, and there were stands all over the place.
Yeah.
And it was just like, okay, well, something needs to change in the mentality, because everybody is doing the same thing. And I call it like the Disneyland mentality, that is this magical place that we've talked about so much on TV and more YouTube and podcasts now, is that everybody's going there, and you get way back in there and you see 3 canoes or whatever and a bunch of tree stands. And so it's, like those spots that just don't look huntable. They just don't look like they'd hold deer, maybe.
Yeah.
I think a key that you said there is overlooked areas, not going deep. It's not about going deep. It could be.
Right.
It very well could be, but it's overlooked areas, or areas that are so hard to get to that it's almost impossible, and you got to find a way.
Sure. Yeah.
What are some of the things you've done? So I know you've told me about some things you do to get where other hunters just won't go. Hi, this is Adam Lewis with DeerIQ.com, and this is your High IQ Moment. Do you know the biggest barriers to public land hunting success? Well, our third biggie is relying too much on smart technology. Yes, there are apps that can really help with a wide variety of things, but what this does is make hunters think this e-scouting is all you need to do to find success. You can find good terrain features like funnels and maybe find success at these locations. But the secret is out, and everyone else is doing the same things. You're very likely just to find another hunter or stand there, or worse yet, not realize it's been pounded by a mobile hunter and worn out the last few days. Don't think you can replace good old-fashioned in-person scouting for what you can see on a screen if you really want to find the best spots away from other hunters. So don't rely too much on your technology, because there's so much it doesn't show that you and others are missing. To see all the barriers standing in your way and new solutions to beating them, get our free public land hunting guide filled with new strategies to beat the crowds and still find success. It's linked below. Check it out. And if you're getting something out of this podcast, consider liking, rating it if you're listening, and sharing with a buddy. It's your help that really helps this podcast and channel grow, and is greatly appreciated. Okay, and now back to the podcast. What are some of the things you've done? So I know you've told me about some things you do to get where other hunters just won't go. What are some of those things that you've done? So you mentioned the overlooked areas. So let's talk about that real quick first. Like overlooked. So you mentioned no trees, right?
Yeah.
Do you ground hunt some?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I do some ground hunting. Sometimes you only need one tree. You only need a fence row. I mean, if you're surrounded by good terrain around it, you don't necessarily need much. And I mean, you mentioned going deep and seeing all these people. I mean, there are still ways where you only have to go 200 yards. And sometimes what I'll see is there's there's a barrier between you and that 200 yards, whether it be a deep river where you can park. You only have to go to the other side of that river. It's only 200 yards from the truck, but people aren't crossing that river. I've hunted spots where you're basically parking right next to a cliff. You only need to go 200 yards to the top of that ridge, but there aren't people doing that. So it's not always going deep, but it's just kind of, I guess, being creative about using your terrain and looking towards those harder to reach spots. I mean, yeah, sometimes you have to go deep, or you do go deep, but I still see that and you mentioned the 1 mile. It still seems like there is a threshold of around that 1 mile where it seems to be the cutoff for a lot of people. Even for people that want to put in the time and go deep per se, still people have this mental cutoff of what they really want to do.
Right. Yeah, it sounds cool when you hear it and you get all excited about it, but then when the rubber meets the road and you are having to pack it in back there, there's this mental barrier of a certain point, and maybe it's a mile-ish or so.
And it can be tough. I mean, that can be tough. I mean, some of the spots that I hunt now, I use my bike a lot. But even I've 2 years ago we had a cold front where I was hunting and I was biking in 2 or 3 miles. Nobody was around, but you're soaking wet by the time you get back in there. So now I'm packing extra clothes. I've got to change in 10 to 15 degree weather. When I get there, I'm basically getting in my boxers, changing into all new clothes, just because you're gonna freeze if you don't, and also you're sweating. So it's challenging. I mean, but if you're the type of person that likes the challenge, you know that going in.
So ground hunting, an option for sure. I think there's a lot of areas where guys overlook because they're so thick or there's no trees. So they automatically assume that I've got to get in a tree to hunt.
Right.
And that's just not the case. And I think that's a huge area that it's tough for hunting on the ground. Me personally, I've done some of it. I've been doing more and more of it, but I'd rather be in a tree.
Sure.
But
yeah.
if it comes to being able to actually get on deer that I want to shoot versus just sitting in a tree and not, you've got to start doing some different things, taking some different approaches to things and what you're doing. Being able to put in the extra, being willing to suffer more than the next guy, than everybody else. You mentioned, other hunters, and I'm curious about this. So how often do you get to a place and other hunters kind of, the idea of hunting other hunters. So you look at other hunters and you let them tell you where you should be versus just trying to find deer sign.
Right. Yeah. That's a huge part of it. Because I mean, yeah, you have to, and what I found is even talking to the other hunters helps a ton. When you get back in from hunting and there's 4 trucks in the parking lot, most hunters are pretty cool and they want to work with you too because they want to have the best hunt. You want to have the best hunt. So I've had a lot of helpful hunters over the year, and even guys that'll be like, hey, no one's in this area. I know there's a tree stand in there. It's a good funnel. I haven't hunted it this year. So most of them, most hunters you run into, they want to work with you because it benefits everybody. But you have to be able to hunt or, almost hunt other hunters. especially on parcels that are heavily hunted. Um, I hunted a spot probably 4 or 5 years ago. After I harvested my deer, I came out and I drove the section, and there were at least 30 other trucks hunting the same parcel as I was. That's a lot. I was fortunate that I did harvest a deer that morning, but I happened to also be in an area where there probably wasn't another guy within maybe a half mile, um, even though there was 25, 30 probably other hunters on there. So you do have to take into account those other hunters, and that's where determining if you're going to be a bow hunter or a gun hunter, because there's a huge difference in those two. I kind of gave up public land gun hunting a few years back, um, just for that reason. Just the amount of hunters on public land during gun hunting. And I really just bow hunt it now. And I've found that, that's a lot more rewarding now than trying to tackle some of the public land during the gun hunts. So,
Yeah, I can get pretty crazy. One thing, yeah, talking about hunter density, right? So you mentioned that, well, there are 30 other guys or whatever in that one block you were hunting. What do you think from your experience, just as far as like, if I see some guys over here hunting, how much padding, I guess, do you feel you need as a bow hunter to still be in good deer from other hunters? Is it a few hundred yards? Is it a quarter of a mile? What have you observed anything with that? Like what you are really looking for?
I mean, that really just, I think, depends on the terrain. I mean, some areas hunt really big, and they're not that big. And it also depends on the deer movement. I mean, I've had guys come on, set up on me within 50 yards, but knowing the history of that spot, I know that the deer got to come by me before they get to them. So it's not so much the distance, it's where you're setting up, I think, in relation to those other hunters. I mean, I was 75 yards from a young Amish kid a couple years ago, but all the deer were working through me before they got to him. So I didn't mind I was 75 yards from him. I mean, I don't like being 75 yards from him. I'd rather be a quarter mile from somebody, but if you're in the right spot and you're only 75 yards, it doesn't really matter, So, and fortunately, he had some friends and I wasn't aware of it. They were doing a push from the north end of this property. He was sitting on the south end. I was sitting in the middle. So all those deer that were being pushed were going by me before they even got to the guy that was intended to push them to. So I actually, again, was fortunate enough. They pushed a nice buck right into me. I ended up killing it. Again, super nice hunters. The guy came up, congratulated me, offered to drag the deer out. So it's, I think, where you're hunting or where you're setting up in relation to the people more than it's got to be this huge buffer sometimes.
Right.
So.
Right. And like you said, the terrain, like how open it is maybe, and
Yeah.
Certain terrain will just hold more deer better than others. Back to the access, I'm curious about, you have a spot you want to get back into. Let's say it is that deep spot, or it's just really, really hard to get to. It's not only overlooked, it's just really hard to get to. What kind of access do you use, or are you looking for? And as far as the time and effort into planning that access, I know that can be a huge, huge make or break thing. Like, for example, when I'm hunting around here in public, when I first started hunting, probably about 12, 13 years ago in public a lot, I really struggled with I want to go way back into the spot, but getting back in there, I probably ruined most of my hunts, right? It was so difficult. So maybe talk a little bit about like what are some good ways to get access to these really hard to access areas without screwing it up, and still have several days worth of good hunting.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things with that. I mean, sometimes it's just boots on the ground. You don't have any choice. There's no good water access. There's no good trails, and yeah, you're gonna bump deer. And it's just a matter of sometimes going for it. Um, you know, One thing I've used over the years is, I think it's still very accessible, using this tactic, is sometimes using private ground to get into the public ground. I've done that a lot over the years. There's a lot of landowners that still um, will maybe let you cross their farm field to get to public land, and you're not hunting, their land per se. And I especially find this with bow hunting. I've talked to a number of guys that, hey, I'm trying to get to that spot of public. Do you mind if I just park here and walk across your field? And a lot of times the answer is still yes. My family does gun hunt a lot. I don't want you doing that, then, but if you're just going to cross, my 200-yard field to go do some bow hunting, go for it. So using public or private land access to get into public, that's still doable. But also being creative. I rarely leave home now without a pedal bike, an electric bike, and a boat. Last year I took all three of those with me. So, the electric bikes, I have mixed feelings about those, because they are letting some of those lazy people back into some good spots. So spots that I used to pedal into, where I wouldn't see anybody. I saw my first person last year on an electric bike back there. I was back there with my electric bike last year also.
You weren't sweating either, were you?
No. But there's still a lot of spots in a lot of states that have regulations on the e-bikes, where you can't do that. So, and even in the same state, what I have found is there's some public land areas, whether it be a walk-in or a wildlife management area, that they can still have their own rules also. One WMA may say pedal bikes only. The next one might say you're allowed to use an electric bike. So I will typically bring both. Last year I pedaled in, I e-biked in. I always usually carry a blow-up kayak along with a motorboat, because you never know when you're gonna, need something like that. For example, a spot I did hunt last year, I actually used a pedal bike to get in a ways, carried waders and a blow-up kayak with me. So fortunately, there was kind of a drought in that area. I was able to get across, in waders, but I also had a blow-up kayak in the trailer behind my pedal bike that I biked all the way in there because I'd never been to the spot before. So you've got to be, I think, creative. And if you really want to get into a spot, there's ways typically to get into it. I haven't done the helicopter thing yet, but people do that. There's a lot of land, especially out west, Wyoming, Montana, stuff like that, where there's these checkerboard parcels of public. Guys are really creative. There's guys that they're taking a helicopter in and going into some of these spots now. So if you want to get there, there's ways. You just got to be creative. So.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is having so much in your arsenal, you can pretty much do whatever you want with whatever you find, and not being like stuck saying, "Oh, I wish I had this to get into this spot." Yep. And also having that, being more willing than the next guy to do what it takes to get there. Because I don't know how many guys would not only ride a bike back in somewhere, but also have waders packed and have an inflatable kayak that when they get back there, they're going to inflate a kayak, put all their junk in it, their gear, their bow, go across the river, and then have to do that all again to get back across, and then do that multiple days. Like, that becomes a lot of work. And that is what, it kind of discourages guys of doing, that you have to have the guts to do it and be willing to do that hard work.
And enjoy it. Some people actually
Yeah.
Some people enjoy misery, especially when it can be rewarding. If misery is rewarding at times, it does make it worth it. And like you said, having that stuff in your arsenal, I think that's a big part of it. Not that you're even going to use it. I've hauled around a blow-up kayak. I hauled around one in my truck for 5 years, and it never moved from the bed of my pickup truck. But I had it. I'm not going to drive 1,000 miles home to go grab one or try to find a Walmart. It doesn't take up much room. It goes in my truck every year. I rarely ever use it, but it's there. So
yeah, if that one time you need it, you want to be able to have it. You don't want it to be the thing that kept you from having a better chance at something. Before the show, we had you take the Deer IQ test, and that's something that everybody can take. It's on the website, and it's just a simple 10-question test. It's kind of fun, and it's not really saying a ton about you, but it's a fun thing. It's challenging, and so when we come back here, we're going to look at talk about your score a bit. So
I might have to preface something before you actually talk about my score. Go ahead, everybody, take the IQ test. It's pretty cool, and it is challenging, but read the questions carefully. My score didn't necessarily reflect, a couple of things. Read the questions carefully. Read in and do a little bit. Just don't think you're gonna know the answer. Put down the answer and move on to the next one.
Right. You can't cheat though. So
right.
So as we wrap up, here are the high IQ takeaways and challenges. First, analyze if you have a Disneyland mentality and what you can do to change this. Second, analyze your accessibility options and tools like Jeff mentioned and what you can do to up your game in that area. And third, take the Deer IQ test so you can compare your score to Jeff's, which will be revealed in the next episode. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you then.